Hi, everybody. If you just want to take your seats. That'd be good and settled. All right, so welcome to this section of the conference. We're all very excited. This is the water territory section. My name is Olivia Noble. I'm a senior environmental policy major at Middlebury. And tonight we're excited to have two great presentations. Summer Alatut could not be here. He is sick, so apologies if you came to listen to him. But you have some exciting presentations in front of you. So the first presentation will be from Chris Sneddon and Colleen Fox. Chris Sneddon is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the Environmental Studies program at Dartmouth College. His research and teaching focuses on conflicts over water, with a primary regional focus on the Mekong River Basin of Southeast Asia. Additional research interests include political ecology of water conflicts, the socio-ecological construction of spatial scale, and the politics of sustainability. His recent publications include an examination of the political economy of fisheries in the Mekong Basin, and a study of the linkages between Cold War geopolitics and the global dissemination of the river basin ideal. Colleen Fox is also a professor, visiting assistant professor of geography at Dartmouth College. Her research and teaching focuses on conflict and cooperation over water resources, with a particular focus on the Mekong River Basin in Southeast Asia also. The research draws on political ecology and critical geopolitics to better understand the socio-political aspects of environmental alteration. Her most recent research focuses on the social dimensions of dam removal in New England. Our second presentation will come from Eve Vogel. Eve Vogel is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Her research focuses on the human environmental dynamics and histories of rivers. In particular, she is interested in river governance institutions and policy and their interaction with wide ecological and social processes and needs. Much of her work is focused on the Columbia River Basin system and on the management history of that regional river basin. Her new project focuses on the Connecticut River. And with that, let's introduce Chris Sneddon and Colleen Fox.
So I guess I received the short end of the stick. So, Colleen, you sure you still want to do this? And Samer Alatut, who's a good friend of mine, asked me to summarize his talk in about 3 seconds. Scarcity and abundance are not what we think, especially in Palestine and Israel. Foucault. That's it. Thank you. So what Colleen and I are here to talk about today, and I've asked her to jump in at any point she would like to, is titled The New Politics of Mekong Hydro Development. Identity, scale, and conflict. It's actually fortuitous that Eve is coming after us. Both ours and Eve's work will be appearing in a book that's coming out, I think, relatively soon, published by Ashcraft, called Negotiating Water Governance, Why the Politics of Scale Matter. I'm not going to say a whole lot about scale today. I think it's a very interesting topic, especially for us geographers. We tend to sort of focus on it, perhaps a little too much at times. But I do want to talk about identity because I think that is a prominent theme of the entire conference, and I think there's been already some very interesting aspects or work that connects identity to water and river basins and watersheds and so on. So I would definitely like to come back to that. In sum, our paper really discusses what we call two basin narratives. We see the Mekong as and the river basin itself as a constructed scale. Constructed in both the social and political sense, but also in the biophysical or the material sense. The first basin narrative, which has been the dominant one and still very much exists in the Mekong region today, began roughly in the mid-1950s, and it was very much a result of some geopolitical and developmental dynamics that we'll talk about a little bit more. Put simply, that narrative has focused on the river basin as presented in various inscriptions, we'll call them, basically maps of a basin, and that became, in a real sense, the Mekong for a succession of engineers, of scientists, of planners, of government officials, both from within the region and from without the region, for, I'd say, at least the last 5 decades. Now contrast that with, so seeing things at this scale of the region or the basin, contrast that with another, whoops, so I'm hitting the button on the thing, thinking that that's going to advance the, now contrast that with another way that the Mekong is experienced. This is the scale of what some landscape ecologists have called the perceptible realm. So most of the 70 million or so basin residents experience the Mekong not as an abstract, bounded object on a page, but they experience it through their daily lives, whether it's through catching fish or using water for growing rice, and it's what some other people have called the human scale. And it's this narrative that, in a very interesting way, has been recast at a larger scale that has formed sort of what we call the new politics of hydropower. Excuse me, I know I shouldn't have eaten that granola right before talking, in the Mekong. So outline of the talk. I think it's important to establish why should we care about damming in the Mekong. I would assume everybody, of course, knows why it's important, but if not, hopefully we want to make the case of explaining why we think that is kind of critical. Second, we will talk about constructing the basin scale. That's that first sort of top-down, state-led construction of the Mekong that began in the mid to late 1950s and continues in various forms today. We'll contrast that with sort of the new or alternative constructions of, again, the Mekong scale, but one that emanates much more from the ground up, so to speak, for maybe lack of a more precise phrase. And then we'll end with some very brief concluding thoughts. And really this question of identity, what is a Mekong identity, revolves around the sort of those two related but also conflicting understandings of what the Mekong is that we'll talk about in parts 2 and 3. So why do we care? Fortunately, if you were here last night, you heard Frank McGilligan, our colleague in dam removal, talk about some of the major reasons why we're concerned about the social and ecological impacts of large dams. I won't go through in detail. This is a very nice, I think, coming out of the World Commission on Dams, a nice sort of idealized representation of both the benefits of large dams. So you see a hydroelectricity being produced. You maybe see a water supply going off to a little city over here. You see maybe some irrigation development and so on. But you also see all of the what many people consider very harmful transformation effects of a large dam. Whether it's loss of livelihoods from fisheries, whether it's displaced people who are now protesting the dam, and we'll come back to that, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to, so we can come back to this, but if you do have further questions about sort of some of the basic impacts that large dams produce, then we can certainly talk about that. We want to emphasize, though, in the Mekong that there are actual dams being constructed, although there is there'll be some argument about this, that the Mekong still remains one of the least altered large river systems in the world, with perhaps the exception of the Congo. It is largely has been undammed for most of its history, and there are some interesting reasons for that. Many of you can probably guess those, and as we move forward, we'll talk more about that. So this is a dam that was actually built in the Chinese portion of the Mekong, where it's known as the Lanchang River in Yunnan province. Again, I don't want to bore you with the history. We could spend all 20 minutes on this slide, but I just wanted to point out this is a bit of the institutional but also geopolitical history of the Mekong. So the latter half of the 1900s, you have French exploration coming to the region, actually looking for a navigable route from China to the South China Sea through what was then Indochina, not finding it so easily. Fast forward to 1957, where the Mekong Committee, which consists of representatives of the governments of Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, importantly just the lower basin, was created. Again, fast forward, what is known in Vietnam as the American War, as many of you may remember that or have at least heard of it, was one of the reasons, prominent geopolitical reasons, for the, sort of the lack of dam construction or the paucity of dam construction. I'm going to put a particular emphasis on fish because they're a really important actor in our story. And important fisheries work and knowledge production by scientists is going on in the early 1970s and carries on. Cambodia falls out of the Mekong Committee in the mid-1970s, comes back in 1991. There's a renewed effort to sort of gear up grand development visions in the region in 1995 with the creation of a new Mekong River Commission, and that is the sort of official intergovernmental river basin authority that's charged with coordinating development decisions around the basin. And it consists, again, of the countries of the lower basin, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And then quickly, because we will talk about this dam towards the end, there's a decision agreement by all 4 countries to postpone the Xayaburi Dam, which has become sort of the focal point of some of the recent contestations around dam construction in the Mekong. And you'll see I have various images interspersed throughout the talk that sort of give you an idea of how we perhaps, or how some people looked at the river basin or the Mekong, certainly in the 1960s. So why do we care about the dammed Mekong? This shows you the black rectangles are dams already constructed by the Chinese government in the upper portion of the basin. The white rectangles are proposed dams on the main stem. So what you're not seeing here, I've got to go both ways, are all the tributary projects that have already been built in the basin. So really for most of its history, because geopolitical and other pressures have prevented the construction of large dams on the mainstream, most of the development that has occurred have been in the tributaries of the Mekong. And the dam that we'll talk about a little bit, this is the Xayaburi, which is located right there. I'll come back to that figure on fisheries, just so keep that in your mind. An estimated 2.6 million tons of fish are produced in the Mekong Basin per year, almost all of which are wild capture fisheries. So minimal aquaculture, making it, the last figure I saw was that all freshwater inland capture fisheries, the Mekong produces 20% of the world's total production in that regard. So if you like fish or if you think fish are important, it's an important place. Some fisheries, well, some of you may not know that in addition, it's a little bit of payback for our photographs appearing last. You knew he was a great fluvial geomorphologist. Maybe you didn't know that he was an expert at catching the giant barb. In all seriousness, it's just some of the figures. I'm already running out of time, so I can tell I'm going to fast forward. In terms of fish diversity, up to 2,000 distinct species, annual production 2.6 million tons per year, worth an estimated 1.4 to 1.9 billion. These are not all subsistence by any means, but they're traded intra-regionally, and some are exported, especially in the Delta region, by Vietnam catfish cultures. Floodplains and fish migrations are extremely important, and this importance is oftentimes localized. So if you think about the Great Lake or Tonle Sap in Cambodia, there you have at least somewhere between 1.3 million people who depend on fisheries for their sole or their dominant source of livelihood, 50% of GDP, incredible source of protein, incredible source of other vital nutrients, calcium, and so on. So it's an incredibly important livelihood resource for people. Let's leave it at that, and there's some sources there if you want to go and find out more. Now, I just like to show the picture of the Mekong giant catfish, and this is usually the point where if anybody remembers anything I say today, it's probably going to be it'll probably go out, but the picture of the giant catfish usually sticks in people's brains. And this is an incredibly endangered species. 10 minutes, all right, so I got to move. But it's just, I think, symbolic of the sort of incredible things that coevolution of hydrology and ecology and, to some extent, human behavior has produced in the Mekong context. This is a grim prognosis from a prominent Mekong fisheries biologist and his team in 2010. That basically, if it looks as if dams will proceed in the Mekong River Basin, it's going to have a fairly severe. Exactly how much of an impact it will have is still debatable, but it will have a severe impact on the river's fish production and economic, nutritional, and social benefits and ecosystem services that this produces for people. I'm going to skip that. All right. There's a decision to defer any development, but as we'll see with the Xayaburi Dam, that hasn't really occurred. So this is getting into the second part, and I'll go through this rather quickly. Essentially, what we have been looking at, and we look at in the paper, is ways that identities around a place, a region, or a river basin are constructed. And to put it, not to put too fine of a point on it, from a geographer named Ansi Páez, who has come up with, I think, a fairly decent schema of understanding this. Basically, what he calls the identity of a region is a process whereby, now with historical context, we'll come back to that if you guys are interested. The identity of a region is often constructed by a state through administrative boundaries, through marketing, through other forms of top-down institutional processes to create something that might be called the greater Mekong subregion, or might be in fact called the Mekong region itself. And you see this sort of top-down construction of regions occurring all over the planet. Maybe economic regionalization is an aspect of that. Now contrast that with the other kind of maybe regional identity that is akin more to regional consciousness. So this is the people's attachments, political, cultural, etc., with a place that we maybe are calling a region. So those of you who feel like you're a New Englander, this maybe give you some sense of the different kind of regional identity, one that's more coming up from the bottom, to simplify it a great deal. Again, the top-down construction started in the late 1950s, and much of it was, as I've been going through a lot of State Department archives from that period, it's very much motivated by the geopolitical architecture of the Cold War, and especially the desire of the United States government to sort of turn Southeast Asia into a group of countries that would be allied with the quote-unquote free world and not allied with the Soviet Union. And it really is interesting to go through some of these historical records and read just how geopolitical the original idea to build dams and to develop economically the river basin was. And there was certainly an element of desire on the part of the governments of the region to use river basin development as a way to foster industrialization and other aspects of modernization. And without getting into too much detail and without giving Bruno Latour too much time today, I do think he wrote this incredibly interesting and seminal article in 1990, and I like it because it's one of the few things he's written that I actually understand, about drawing things together. And he's referring to what he calls inscriptions. And so these are maps and graphs and tables and other representations of physical things that we as scientists or social scientists or just as lay people use all the time and see all the time. So I bet for most of you, if you've had any engagement with the Mekong or some other river basin, a lot of it has come through staring at a map on an 8.5 by 11 page. And so he refers to these things as inscriptions, and one of the things he does in this work from 1990, it's called Drawing Things Together, is he talks about what these kinds of inscriptions do in the service of transfers of knowledge about geographically diverse places, but also about maintaining networks of ideology and material relations. And the inscriptions, to make a long story short, you can be happy to share the paper if you'd like to read more about it, help maintain these networks and become very powerful as a result. How do they work? They both move, so they're mobile, and they retain their shape, so they're immutable. And again, Latour is filled with these kinds of catchy phrases. They become then immutable mobiles. Why are they powerful? They're convincing to allies. They make some things visible. They keep some things hidden. They tend to speak a universal language, in the case of maps, of cartography, and they serve as passage points. So this same map of the Mekong, produced in 1957 or 1956, has been reproduced literally thousands of times and comes down through consultants' reports, government reports, other academic papers, and so on. So the point, one of the things we argue, this is for the experts, this has become the Mekong, and for the government officials as well in the basin. This is one of the inscriptions that we look at in our paper, and I think it really, 5 minutes, okay, so I'm going to really move along. And what it literally does is draw things together. I'll make this really quick. This is a staircase, so it really emphasizes how much hydroelectric potential there is on the main channel of the Mekong. It's a drawing. It's a drawing of things, in this case dams. There's the different things. And it's bringing them literally together on the page in a way that simplifies and lops off and keeps certain things hidden. And that's Zyaburi, the dam that we'll talk about, where there's been the site of protest up there on the upper left. So you can sort of see that, and that's the schema. So literally, I'm not going to go through all these. You see this through reports after report, different images and representations. And it's not just the Mekong. If you look at the United States Bureau of Reclamation, their international activities, roughly from the early 1950s throughout the mid-1970s, they were simply going, don't worry, I was not going to talk about each of these. I wanted just to give you the idea of these inscriptions, and there's basin after basin after basin. To the point again, inscriptions are very powerful and do certain kinds of works. Okay, now let's get to our alternative constructions. And this actually, it was really nice to see this subsession labeled water territories, because we actually talk about water territories in our paper. And there's some recent work in anthropology and related fields talking about water territories, in some ways synonymous with the idea of a waterscape, but these are watersheds as a sort of political identity, but one that's also infused with culture, cultural history, with livelihood processes. But in this particular work that we were using is focused on the Andes, but I think you can apply it as well. Where's Mike? I think New Zealand has some elements of this as well. And the idea is that what has happened in the Mekong, to sum up our kind of argument as we go through it in the paper, is that this collection of sort of community level and sometimes individual level collective efforts focused on water territories have themselves been scaling up to speak about a Mekong identity, but one that is very much in contrast to the top-down, more technocratic, more expert-driven and state-driven construction of the Mekong, to one that talks about, it speaks actually in the terms of our Mekong, and one that is fundamental to livelihoods, and draws the connections between a dam being constructed in Laos having a major impact on the ecological and hydrological dynamics of the Great Lake, or Tonle Sap, in Cambodia. So that's in a nutshell what we're talking about when we go through. There's a history to this, and a lot of it is emanating from Thailand, where you had an increasingly strong civil society occurring in the late 80s and 1990s, going up through it. And one of the seminal protests that occurred over dams in Thailand was around the Bak Moon Dam. To make a long story short, there was an effort by local fishing communities who lost much of their livelihood resources to this dam to actually take over the dam, and they literally took the dam over in 1999 and declared it like sort of a free zone, and they kicked out the operators non-violently. And eventually they were able to convince the government to actually open the gates of this dam and have some of the fisheries come back. And it's still now a point of controversy about how often this is, how often we can keep those dam gates open. So our Mekong, these are just images, again, of the human scale, of the connection between livelihoods of the Mekong and thinking of the perceptible realm. So getting us away from staring at the basin on the map. And now we get to our kind of conclusion. Oh, good, luckily. And Colleen has actually been working more on this, so she may, in the question and answer session, may want to come back to some of these and maybe is in a better position to answer them. Since late 2000s, the noughts, actually private investment firms and construction companies and a coalition of Chinese, Korean, Thai, Malaysian investors have come to the Mekong River Commission and the governments of the region to propose a series of large dams on the mainstream of the Mekong. The first one to sort of move ahead, sponsored by the Lao government, but not paid for by the Lao government, it costs about $3.2 billion, was at Xayaburi, which again was one of those original dam sites identified way back in the late 1950s by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation as a place where you'd want to build a dam. And so led part by Thailand, but also groups from Cambodia, there has been sort of a region-wide uprising, if you will, with certain caveats, not so much in Laos, not so much in Vietnam, again, because of the specific political conditions there. But a series of protests against some of the companies that are involved in constructing the Xayaburi Dam, protests against the Lao government. The U.S. government, after leaving the region in 1975 on the helicopters, is now back actually entering into the discussion around Mekong dams. And actually has one senator came out and stood on the Senate floor and said, this is a bad idea to build this dam. It's an intriguing geopolitical angle that we can get into if you'd like to pursue this. But what we think is very interesting and really important about this recent wave is that we think that it maybe is a tipping point in terms of Mekong's, the history of its development, but also the history of what it means to people. We don't want to carry this too far, and we don't want to romanticize the efforts of community groups and individuals who are protesting the Xayaburi Dam. It looks as if the Lao government is just going to go ahead and build the dam regardless, even though they say they're not. But there's you can see photos of the big earth-moving machinery and things like that going on. But we think that maybe, and this is a good place, I think, to conclude, that this represents a kind of new politics, a new sort of Mekong regional identity, one that is, again, really built up from people whose maybe not foundational identity, that's going too strong, but an important aspect of their identity is based on this notion of livelihoods and the human scale and the perceptible realm, but then they're projecting that politically to include the entire Mekong Basin itself as a focus of political resistance. Thank you very much. Uh-oh, good.
Yeah, and we're just going to ask that you hold all questions until afterwards. We'll have a question and answer session with our faculty moderator. So next up is Eve Vogel.
So, first of all, thanks so much for having me here. It's really great to be part of a small conference where there are people that you can actually sit and listen to and look forward to talking to them afterwards, instead of one of those giant, like, thousands of people's of conference and, you know, lost in the ocean of whatever. Anyway, it's really a pleasure. And anyway, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. So three caveats. First is I, in my sophisticated use of PowerPoint, have my notes carefully on my PowerPoint slides, but they're not actually affiliated with that computer at this point. So anyway, I'm going to be switching my computer and your computers at the same time, and so hopefully it'll work. The second is this is an ambitious project, and I say so humbly, in part because of the time constraints, that I'll be trying to cover a lot of ground in a very short time, and just ask your patience and understanding. You'll see what I mean, but I'm also really excited to do that and to be here and to talk to you, because it is ambitious, and I'm really trying to synthesize a whole bunch of history and a whole bunch of comparative study, at least into a really interesting hypothesis, and I'm really interested in what other people think about it. So with that, let's see. So I'm pressing to this here, right? So my title is The Long-Term Consequences of Trans-Jurisdictional River Basin Governance, Patterns and Consequences. And another title could be, or Can River Basin Management Really Overcome Political Geographical Fragmentation? And my focus river basins for the day are the Tennessee, the Connecticut, and the Columbia River. I've done original research on the Columbia, as the introducer talked about, and have started recently on the Connecticut. The Tennessee is strictly based on secondary research, as well as some other river basins like the Mekong that I draw on, some other people who've written about it. So let's see. So there is an idea of watershed and river basin management that Dr. McGinnis talked about, Chris talked about, many of you have heard about. It's an idea in which the river basin or the watershed is really an ideal territory and space in which to manage water resources. And so to start with, let's think about why. What is this? So the theory is that watershed and river basin management have governance within a river basin geography. They're multi-jurisdictional. You have multiple stakeholder participation. And that's instead of conventional jurisdictional boundaries and technocratic political decision-making. I'm trying to figure out which screen to look at. I'm a little overwhelmed by the technology in the room here. Okay, and the claimed results is that you get more democratic participation, wider social benefit, and better environmental sustainability. So the piece of this that I'm really focused on is this one, the geography and its role in leading to those claimed results. And this is not one that people have actually looked at that much, despite the fact that the geography plays such an important role in this theorization. So my research addresses two specific questions that are not well covered in other research on river basin management. First, what are the effects of organizing water management within river basin territories? And secondly, what happens over the long term? So not just in the first 5 or 10 years, but after these river basin management territories become sort of the old bureaucratized management systems we like to diss in other shapes, then what happens? My approach is I look at long-term histories. I'm interested particularly in formal institutions of river basin management with independent authority, because those are the instances in which you clearly have delegated governance authority to a new territory and reorganized it in a new geographic way. So I will be talking about informal river basin management, but that's not my research focus. I'm interested in political geographical dynamics. I see this actually as fundamentally a political geographical question of you're trying to create a new political territory, a new political geography, what happens? And I'm also interested in not only what happens institutionally and politically, but what actually happens on the ground and in the water, and for people as well because of that. And finally, I think it's crucial to do comparative study. That's why I started out talking about the Columbia and researching the Columbia for well over a decade, but I've moved on to thinking about other river basins as well. So what's the ideal? In the ideal, we have this linkage. And the first thing I did in my research to really try to think this through is what's the logic there? So what I did is I analyzed documents from development banks, non-governmental organizations, government agencies, and scientists to find what they think a river basin geography has to do, and this is really where it comes down. They think a river basin geography is going to be able to get you out of all the constraints and confines and conflicts of conventional jurisdictional boundaries and their administrations and their bureaucracies. So that's why my subtitle, or my second title, of Can They Really Do That? So I made a chart, and this is another one of those, like Jessica's, of this chart is too much, but I'm going to try to cover it anyway. So down the left-hand column, you'll see the other columns later. The river basin watershed ideal in the political-geographical relationship is supposed to be that the river basin geography overcomes traditional political spaces. And then because of that, you get holistic management. I won't go into all these details, but it's different kinds of integrating of goals, decision-making, you get balanced management, and then you get holistic benefits distribution. So basically, a natural hydrological space is supposed to be a holistic space that then creates holistic management, that then provides better social and environmental benefits, greater efficiencies, and less conflict. So that's the ideal. There's the logic. So what this looks like schematically might be this. You've got 3 countries or states. You see the watershed boundary in green, the river in blue. This is what we might think of water management normally having to deal with. And in a river basin or watershed ideal, the political boundaries go away, the watershed boundary emerges, and as a result, you get management that includes irrigation, that's the green squares. It includes hydropower. It includes dams, but not too many. Right? So you still have fish and you still have trees, and the cities don't get too big, and there are several of them in different parts of the basin. You don't concentrate geographically too much, right? And just to, there's both cities and factories in here, so the thing with just one pipe is a factory, and the thing with multiple spires is a city. All right, so what's the reality from empirical histories? And I'm going to argue there are really 3 patterns. And the first comes out of the Tennessee Valley Authority and others that have been critiqued like it. And basically the idea is that you have a unified authority that turns into authoritarian unity. So let's see if I can read from my notes on this one. So created in the US during the Great Depression, the TVA was initially envisioned as a truly holistic river basin management effort. In its early years, it aimed to build dams for power, navigation, and flood control, help farmers conserve soils, reforest the hillsides, support farmers' cooperatives, build idyllic new communities and industrial centers, foster wide civic participation, and spread cheap electricity to ease life and to power economic development. Sound familiar? I mean, it's not, this is 1930s, right? But it's very similar in many ways to what we think today we're trying to do that's supposed to be so different. But critics say that a unified authority did not provide for holistic management. Instead, the TVA advanced federal, that is national priorities, rather than regional priorities, and they say that it was a direct outcome of its identity as a federal agency. So what were the consequences? Well, they weren't all good. So some of the bad ones were it flooded huge areas of fertile valley land, displaced well over 50,000 people, reinforced the power of white and landowning farmers over black and tenant farmers, largely abandoned its agricultural and forestry missions by about World War II, so within about 12 years, basically so that it could produce electricity for first the World War II war machine and later the Korean and Cold War war machines. And what was the effect geographically? It wasn't to bring rural prosperity. It was to create urban immigration into the large cities, industrial concentration, much the same kind of thing that we've seen in other places. So I drew a schematic of this. see if I have it, or do I have the chart first on this one? I don't know, I'm on the wrong computer. Oh, before I have my schematic, I just want to point out that a lot of other histories of other river basins around the world really echo this story. And these are just a few: the TVA, the Damodar in India, Latin America river basin organizations. And not surprisingly, as Chris's images showed, many of these were actually modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was just one quote. This is evidently a technocratic and top-down approach. In general, it cannot be said this provided satisfactory results. So what's that look like? Well, cities get bigger. Industries get bigger, irrigation takes over. The blue lines between the green spaces are out-of-basin transfers. The river basins disappeared, so have the smaller political territories, and what you get is the national political territory, or in a case like the Mekong, this would be effectively a geopolitical territory. In terms of the chart, guess what? The river basin does overcome traditional political spaces. But that doesn't create holistic management. It creates imposed authoritarian management. And it creates large economic GDP gains, but also large social and environmental losses. It may be efficient in some ways, but it externalizes costs onto the poor, the rural, and the environment. There's less conflict, but that's because it's suppressed. Okay. The good news is that although that's an incredibly compelling story, and it definitely happens, at least according to many of the histories we hear, it's actually not nearly as common as this one. It's a much more common story that river basin management attempts either don't ever really get going, they're envisioned and idealized, and they really aren't ever institutionalized because they're fought off too hard, or else they get institutionalized and they die within 10 to 30 years. So my case study for this is the Connecticut River Basin. I drove here along the White River Valley, and if the visions for the Connecticut River had come true, that would have had large dams up and down it, and there would have been no flooding in 2011. No occasional flooding, but there would have been permanent flooding. So towns throughout Vermont and New Hampshire would have been flooded permanently to provide flood control, multi-purpose dams, and a whole bunch of other, mainly flood control and hydropower for New England and potentially beyond. So it didn't happen. Why not? Because there was tremendous opposition. And in fact, there was no other valley authority ever created in the United States, because every federal agency in existence hated the idea, because that was going to take their responsibilities for agriculture, for building dams, for soil conservation away from them and give it to this unified agency. So at the federal government level, every agency opposed it. At the local level, people hated it. People in Vermont got out. When the engineers came and they surveyed, they harassed them. Local governments refused to give them permits to have gas rations. The governor, George Aiken, was governor and then senator, was the major person who fought off any kind of major Connecticut River Valley Basin development. So they used every tool that they could: harassment, local ordinances, state policies, federal lobbying, and they didn't totally stop flood control, because the Connecticut River really flooded a lot, and it really caused a lot of problems in like 1936 and 1938 and 1948 to 9 and 1955, and those floods kept coming. And Massachusetts and Connecticut, even though they really didn't want federal dams, they kind of didn't want Holyoke and Springfield and Hartford to keep on like being totally devastated, and so they basically cajoled New Hampshire and Vermont into accepting a certain number of dams. So instead of 40 some odd dams, there were 13. And instead of being high dams that would be multiple purpose and have permanent reservoirs, they're almost all dry bed reservoirs, or filled only to 2%, 3% capacity, so that they can provide maximum flood control while impacting valleys as little as possible. So what's this look like? Each state goes its own way. So in my little diagram, we have country or state A that develops its river up the wazoo, puts a lot of its city and industry right at the downstream end of its river so that all those negative effects can go into the downstream country. And you still get the urbanization, but it's sort of state by state, country by country. And you'll notice the rural areas don't get a lot of anything. There are still a few fish, however, because there aren't quite as many dams left way up in the upper reaches. They're, of course, not the anadromous, diadromous fish, but the resident fish. So what's this look like on our chart? This time, traditional political spaces overcome a river basin geography. And no, you don't get holistic management. You get fragmented management. You can't do a lot of things. So, for example, Frank McGilligan talked yesterday about all the little dams everywhere in New England. It's pretty hard to address those little dams in any kind of comprehensive way when you don't have any kind of real basin-wide management system in the Connecticut River, and you don't. It's very hard to do that, in any kind of governmental level on a regional basis. So there are real things you cannot do. However, there are ways that you could argue that although this wasn't holistic, it was actually more balanced than it would have been. You don't have holistic distribution of benefits. You have space, political space by political space. And then what do you get? You get a patchwork of benefits and costs. You have often high downstream costs across borders, completely inefficient. But your total cost may be lower because you just can't do as much. And you have intractable conflict that you solve by fragmentation. Okay, thanks. I'm doing better than I was feared. Okay, pattern 3, parceling out the watershed. So in our first pattern, river basin geographies beat out traditional political geographies. In our second pattern, traditional political geographies beat out river basin geographies. In this pattern, they have to negotiate with each other, and they do so on a long-term basis. And my case study is the Columbia River Basin. So there was no other TVA ever built in the United States, but the closest thing was in the Columbia. And the story basically goes that there was opposition to a valley authority, but people really wanted dams in this region. They weren't as many settled valleys. It was a much more of an undeveloped economy, and so a lot of people wanted federal dams. They just wanted to make sure those federal dams benefited them. There was a fight over whether that was going to be local or regional. Basically, there was a compromise that was made, and the compromise was we're going to have traditional federal agencies build the dams. We're going to have a new regional agency that markets and transmits their power. And it's a long, complicated, convoluted history I won't bother with at the moment since time is tight. But the end of the story is that the Bonneville Power Administration, a regional federal power agency like the TVA but strictly based on power, really became the core of quite an integrated river basin management system in the Columbia. So there's the BPA transmission lines on the left, the dams that are part of the system on the lower left, and the vision of what this looks like in the 1990s, you can see includes both fish and dams, fish, wildlife, and dams. So basically what happens with this parceling out the watershed pattern is you have a single agency that gets attacked from every corner all the time, or at least fairly frequently over time, and it responds by doling out benefits. So in the case of the BPA, early on it doled out dams. Oh, Montana, you're not liking where we're proposing that dam? We'll give you one where you want. Oh, Idaho, you don't want us to take our water? Let us, lobby for some irrigation for you. Oh, anyway, you get the idea, right? So first it was dams. It was always cheap power. We'll recruit industry for you that, of course, is going to want cheap electricity. We'll deliver more transmission lines to bring you cheap power. And then in recent years, interestingly enough, a key benefit that's been doled out is money for fish and wildlife mitigation. So, parceling out the watershed, you still get complete overdevelopment, and it happens everywhere, but it's much more spatially equalized. And along with irrigation, hydropower, industry, cities, You also get a lot of money for mitigation. You get money to conserve some areas. And those, see the dollar sign next to the fish? You get very expensive hatcheries and other sorts of things. All right, so what's this look like? In this one, the river basin geography negotiates with traditional political spaces. You get overdevelopment, but it evens out spatially, and benefits are parceled out to these conventional political territories. Oh, the other thing I should add is that decision-making over time actually gets to be much more inclusive. So decision-making authority is also something that's parceled out. You get high benefits. They're widely spread and shared, but you also get large negative impacts. I would argue that overall this is the closest of the three to the river basin ideal. But it sure ain't perfect. And one of the key costs is huge amounts of money. The BPA spends about $400 million every year on fish and wildlife mitigation. Some people say it's the most expensive ecosystem protection effort in the world. And that's part of what helps it stay around. You get ongoing conflict, but it's actually fought and negotiated. So, conclusions. First of all, we need a better political geographic model of river basin management that doesn't just imagine it as a unitary space, but as an interactive one that's interacting with other political geographical spaces. Second, it's not just some confusing, obstructive, annoying thing we have to deal with. They're real patterns, and if we understand them, we can actually work with them in potentially constructive ways. These are the patterns I'm going to argue, and I'll save any details into the Q&A. Outcomes, none of these are holistic in the way we envision. They all have pros and cons. And if we have an idea of what we actually want in those pros and cons and how we want to balance them, we might have an idea of whether it's worth it to do this or not. Definitely need to do further comparative research. I'm out of time, but this raises lots of questions. These are US-based, democratic. I do have in the paper some comparative cases, but they're very small. This is a federal system. These are all rivers with a lot of water. The Columbia is a river with a ton of hydropower. All of those things make these a little bit unusual stories, and so a key question is sort of how applicable are these patterns around the world, and how much do they tell us in different contexts? Thank you.
And this is our faculty moderator, Dan Brayton. He'll handle Q&A.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks for the excellent presentations. I'm Dan Brayton of the English and American Literatures Department and the Environmental Studies program. I work on literature, culture, and the marine environment, so if you'll forgive me, I'm a fish out of water. I'm interested in the way human beings imagine the marine environment and what we think we know about it. So naturally, when I think about these excellent presentations, I think about fish or critters. So I'd like to draw some strange connections between these two excellent presentations by talking about critters, aquatic fauna, and then sort of cycle back to some commonalities between them in order that the rest of you may formulate your wonderful questions while I babble a little bit. The Mekong River, catfish. How many left? 4 or 5? A few hundred. They're going. Columbia River, how many salmon going up the fish ladders at the Bonneville Dam? Lots, 2 million, mostly hatchery, lots of and sea lion issues. Salmon fishery in the West Coast, Pacific Northwest, not doing so great. Alaska's a different story. How about those Yangtze River dolphin? How about the Gangetic dolphin? Sorry, I'm not talking about fish. I'm talking about marine mammals as well. I raise these iconic species not just to suggest that, of course, as we all know, there's a massive ecological cost to developing rivers, but also to point to some of the human costs. I'm particularly interested in the declining ethnosphere. If we believe anthropologist and ethnobotanist Wade Davis, human languages are more endangered than the flora and fauna of the earth and going extinct at a more rapid rate. So I just want to suggest to you a strange idea, and that is that we might look at these threatened, endangered, or indeed extinct river species as sentinels of a decreasingly diverse ethnosphere. And I just enjoin you to think about the untold stories of the people and peoples affected by the development of river systems. The TVA, when I was in high school, was taught as an unmitigated good. And of course, I was receptive, coming from a family of with deep FDR Dem roots. Clearly, the human costs were enormous and probably much of it untold. So too with the Mekong, and I wonder whether Eve's discussion is particularly gloomy, or when we think about the future of the Mekong, or might in fact be very productive. So there are many ways in which I think we can cycle back around to the common issues in these presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. So, who has a question? And please use the mic. Lindsay.
Hi. This question is for Professor Vogel. It has to do with, I'm curious because your examples were all about the states in the in America and their interactions involving these rivers, but I'm curious about how the three examples you gave about interactions, how they change when rivers are international. Like what happens if international institutions don't align with each other and don't see eye to eye with these types of issues?
You get the second one? Institutional failure, fragmentation, and ad hoc coordination. That's the easy answer. In the paper, I draw on a few examples, including the Mekong, thanks to reading Chris's and Colleen's work. So I think the Mekong is actually an example of that, where you had something that was imposed, but it couldn't stand up next to things like the Vietnam War, and it fell apart and it's been recreated. But even now, you have a country that's not even part of it that happens to control the headwaters. So that's an example. So I really think the second pattern is by far, far, far the most common one. There are some cases of the first and the third that I think I found, although I'm doing it from secondary literature again, not my own original research. But the first one really I think is a temporary one. It happens for 10 to 30 years, and then it usually falls apart into the second or the third. But so, for example, there were these things imposed around the world, many of them by national governments. So the Damodar River Corporation in India was in many ways the first one, but really ends up being the third. But that's a federal country with Indian states really contesting what happens, and so it ends up much more sort of in the third pattern. Mexico imposes something in the 1940s that falls apart by the 1960s. Those are both federal states, So I keep coming, I guess, back to where it's really been imposed successfully is either in this geopolitical context, like the Mekong, or else as national basins across federal, and where they're international ones. I don't know. That's why I wanted to see what you guys thought. The Columbia is international. Good point, Chris. Columbia is international. The Connecticut sort of, yeah, I actually, it's true, the Connecticut has a tiny bit in Canada, but it's irrelevant practically for overwide management. But in the Columbia, it's very relevant. And it's really been, this system works. binationally. There's a book coming out on the Columbia River Treaty. I have a chapter in there, but I don't think there's any doubt that the treaty is going to be renewed. It's a question of what are the details going to be. But it worked binationally in the Columbia. So when the Canadian treaty dams were built, Canada got 50% of the hydropower. And then in the 1990s, when the agreement about that 50% came to term after 30 years, there were local jurisdictions in the eastern part of British Columbia, the Canadian part of the basin, that fought against BC, and they said, we need some of ours. And then they got a certain allotment of that 50%. So in two different levels, the parceling out the watershed pattern has continued into the Canadian portion of the basin. I don't know if that made sense, but.
Can I add a point to that? Please. Chris and I have written a bit about this in terms of looking critically at cooperation. So the Mekong has often been held up, or at least in the past few decades, as a model of transboundary cooperation, and seen as something for other basin authorities to emulate. But again, you have to ask, what is the cooperation in the service of? And very often, states were cooperating in agreeing to build dams, and it's the river basin it was that kind of geopolitical economic vision of a region, of a basin. So in some ways, from someone who's interested in social issues or the ecological integrity of the river, the success of the Mekong River Commission as a developmental agency, sort of as Eve pointed out with these basins that become transformed, was something that people worried about. And people who looked at it more carefully were saying, this is not a model, and it's not something that really is resulting in a desirable outcome, even though it looks like really great cooperation between these states they were turning battlefields into the marketplace, in the language of one of the Thai prime ministers or premiers in the mid-90s. So there's some ways in which that gets complicated when you look at a place like the Mekong.
Yeah, this is for Chris and Colleen, but I think it goes along with something that Eve brought up, and also going back to Mike's stuff. But it's a question of terminology, and I'm really interested in what you mean by water territories. How would you define water territory? How does it differ from other ways of thinking about maybe trans-jurisdictional watersheds? And why is it an important term, or what could we do with that?
I'll take a shot. I was thinking about that question just as I was, because it wasn't something that I was immediately drawn to, that use of the word water territory. And again, this folks working in the Andes, which are much different geographical, historical, political context than Southeast Asia and the Mekong area. But I'll give you, I think, what is just one dimension of what I think of as why it might be useful. So in political geography, we traditionally think about territorialization as a process, again, typically undertaken by states to define, delineate, count, convert into statistics, and somehow exert control over a population and the resources that exist within that territory. And typically we think of that as sort of politically bounded. I think what these authors and other folks who maybe are sort of contemplating when they say water territory in the sense we used it today is a counter-territorialization, one that is undertaken by water-based communities. These are, again, some of the language that's used in the Andes. And when you think about some of the recent global protests against privatization of urban water supplies, Bolivia is kind of one of the classic cases, resistance to elite landowners kind of consolidating land, and sort of struggles over land and water at the same time. That's how I see it as a potentially useful term. So it's turning territorialization around from being a state activity and saying, we're going to exert an identity and based on our livelihoods and over the territory that we use. So maybe it's not a perfect term, maybe it's just semantics, and we could argue that, but that's sort of how I see it as maybe one potentially useful dimension.
Eve had a question about the TVA. And one of the things in my water policy class, one of the things I always talk about is the sort of uniqueness in many ways of TVA, in fact, of certain water organizations. I mean, it's pretty rare that any agencies are so regionally bounded like BUREC or TVA. But also one of the huge differences with TVA is that there's no congressional oversight. And so one of the key things there is I was wondering what the geography that you're seeing and the economic geography that you're seeing results from the institutional structure of TVA, as well as not necessarily just the vision of it, but the institutional structure of it.
I don't know that I can answer that fully. One thing I've wondered about, but I don't know enough about TVA actually, is about the difference between the TVA and the BPA. Because the BPA also has no congressional oversight, and they both are largely self-funded, the BPA entirely, and TVA 98%, which through its power proceeds funds its power program, and that gives both of them a huge amount of independence, although they both still borrow from the US Treasury, and therefore still have to get economic political pressure put on them. So the way it works in the Columbia, the politics of it is that the senators and representatives that represent the territory that BPA serves, those are the most important political players. Because there's a sort of a quid pro quo standard practice in the US Congress that if a regional delegation hangs together and says, this is what we want, that other regional delegations will let them have that because they don't want someone to go after theirs. So the political pressure is making sure that all the senators and representatives from Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho stay together in pushing for whatever it is that's going to protect BPA or shift it in a few cases, in case of the Northwest Power Act. So I don't know that that's that different in terms of institutional structure, but BPA's in a way a little bit more dependent and a little less independent than the TVA, and I have wondered whether that has made it more accountable in some ways.
You know, I don't have my follow-up myself.
Yeah.
I've just been working in Turkey, and one of the things, Cadena and GAP, they speak specifically that the TVA is the model for them. So if you're looking for international examples, GAP is actually one that's modeled pretty much singularly on TVA.
Quick follow-up to I love the TVA. I can talk about it. The thing that's interesting to me about the TVA too is that it was almost instantly mythologized, and in a lot of ways, the myth of the TVA, the ideal, propagated by David Lilienthal, who was one of the early co-leaders, along with Arthur Morgan, and I think it was Gordon Clapp. I always forget the third guy. Harcourt Morgan, yes. And there was this tremendous I really appreciate Eve's patterns. I'm not sure that the authority was as authoritative or as unified as maybe that suggests, especially in the early days. But what almost immediately happened, especially after Lilienthal wrote Democracy on the March in 1944, and even prior to that, is that the TVA idea became internationalized. Not what actually happened in the TVA, but this idea that you can have a basin, you can have dams, you can put them anywhere. In 1949, Gordon Clapp went on a UN fact-finding mission to Palestine and said, what we're going to do with the Palestinian refugees is we're going to build an Arab TVA on the Litani River Basin. And there was a question about, and it was going to provide jobs for 600,000 displaced people, not displaced by a dam, interestingly enough. Lyndon Johnson proposed $2 billion to go to Mekong development to create a TVA on the Mekong. So Frank, you're absolutely right. It's the Damodar. So it's this amazing a diffusion of the ideal of the TVA. That's one of the things I'm looking at. The Bureau of Reclamation did its own diffusion, but of much different things, more the ideal of the large multi-purpose dam. But they were also into the kind of river basin planning business. So we could talk forever, but interesting stuff. Yeah.
Hello. This one is for the two of you. And I'm interested in local identity in the Mekong River Basin, where dams are being built. And I'm wondering whether the damming has kind of it gives identity to the people, like an additional layer of identity, or whether it kind of removes the identity. The second question is, resistance. Can you talk about different patterns of resistance between the different countries? Obviously, you said that there's kind of political conditions that make it difficult maybe to compare, but maybe you do have one or two.
I can start talking about identity then. One of the things that we found very interesting is that, particularly with this most recent dam on the mainstream, the Zayaburi, that it seems that there has been this process of shifting identities around the dams. And the story thus far is that most of the impacts of dams have been at the sub-basin level. So there haven't been these mainstream dams that have encouraged people to think about themselves in quite the same way as kind of Mekong residents. Catherine has been to some of these Mekong dialogues. So for years, organizations like Terra, towards ecological recovery and in Southeast Asia, Living Rivers, Siam, these organizations have tried to craft this idea of a watershed identity. They have publications called Watershed. They host these dialogues where dam-affected peoples from Laos, Cambodia, Thailand will come together and talk. But with the Zayaburi Dam, now you're even seeing, like in northeast Cambodia, there are a bunch of communities are being affected by dams being built on the Saisan River in Vietnam, and there's this emergence of NGOs that are not only trying to connect with each other in the region as sort of like as the people of Rattanakkiri, as sort of a separate identity within Cambodia, but they're also involved in protests in Bangkok. And so I think that's one of our main point that we like to make is that as mainstream dams become a reality on the mainstream, you see an intensification and acceleration of the environmental impact in such a way that people's livelihoods in Cambodia around Tonle Sap are affected by what's going on in Laos. I think for the first time in history. So the dams in the mainstream in China have evoked responses downstream in Thailand and Laos. People saying we're losing our gardens, our flood recession gardens, and our livelihoods are being disturbed. But I think something different is going on with these mainstream dams, and we don't have a tremendous amount of evidence, but that's our suggestion is that environmental alteration is actually leading to some new types of identity formation. I don't know if you have any examples. A few examples of resistance.
Maybe not examples, but also I wanted to be really careful about saying that I think we were greatly oversimplifying how we've used identity in our work. We would like to do more research in that regard. And also, I think there's a real risk of romanticizing the Mekong Basin residents. I mean, I'm sure millions of people living there don't give a hoot, not to say about what's going on with the Mekong, because they have other, fundamental realities in their lives and things they have to worry about. What I think is interesting is that, and again, this is a common strategy with some of people may be familiar with the idea of jumping scales. The idea of some of the groups I had a conversation with a Thai NGO worker who's been just a social agitator for his whole life, basically, sort of going through the labor movement, the farmers movement in Thailand in the 70s, student movement involvement, and all kinds of things. And basically, at a point in the late 1990s, he said, we know how to deal with the Thai government. We can stop a dam being built in Thailand anytime we want. I mean, they were so effective at mobilizing media and students and a diverse coalition, international groups, et cetera. The real problem is the Thai government is now simply going across its borders into Laos or into Cambodia, Myanmar, and well, not so much Vietnam, but perhaps even Vietnam, and just importing electricity and working out agreements that way. So in Vietnam, the way you work through the political system is much different. You work through the party system. But not to say that you can't have an impact, because there is a fairly well-defined hierarchy of how you would bring a complaint to broader levels. In Laos, it's much different. It's a little more fluid. Sorry to use that, but I wanted to use it at least once. It's fluid, and it's also there are very little models of civil society engagement in Laos for people to follow. So that's, again, some of the Thai NGOs are trying to work on that. Cambodia, it's amazing because a lot of people argue now in Cambodia that this sort of the pro-community fisheries coalitions are like at the vanguard of sort of social and political changes in the entire country. And all this runs up against, though, what do you change first? Do you focus on sort of Mekong level resistance, or do you try to change the government? I mean, that's, I think, the million-dollar question. And changing the government, obviously, is an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous prospect in all the countries there. Sorry.
Thank you. This is a question for Tuive. I really enjoy your presentation. I look forward to read the paper. The way I see it, this is like a typology, what you have identified, like three main types of governance, of institutional design for governance, and you have identified the consequence. In a way, you have.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it as institutional evolution in a way.
My question is, what about if you keep institutional design, if you control for institutional design? Because I'm not sure that you're going to have the same consequence in the same type of institutional design, but the institutional design might combine with other factors to have different impact. Right. Okay. For example, I'm thinking about unified authority. Of course, I don't know much the case that you mentioned, but I was trying to translate that typology to cases I know from South America, and most of the cases that I could think were cases of institutional design that were created by military regimes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there was a strong lack of democratic governance for the origins, but it was very efficient to solve conflict, as you said, because it's suppressed. So it stayed after the democratic regimes came in. And I'm not thinking about water just issue, but other, for example, metropolitan governance issues like waste management, Santiago, Chile, and Buenos Aires. Okay, so the question is, what about if you have system of unified authority, but in democratic, I mean, you maintain the same institutional design, you control for institutional design, but it changed other variables. I would think it would be a very interesting to see as if you're planning to keep forward with this research agenda to see if the consequences vary.
Yeah, so I should just say that if any of you want to work with me on a broader comparative project, that's really where I see this potentially going. There's no way that I can take on like the depth that I've put into the Columbia, that I'm beginning to put into the Connecticut, and do it in 40 river basins around the world. So if there are those of you who want to work with me, let's talk, because I think it could be a great grant. And there are a ton of variables, including institutional design, and I think institutional design comes in not only in the front end, but also if you can see these patterns developing, how do you respond to them institutionally, or how do you take advantage of their good points and head off some of their bad points? So, how do you think proactively about it? What's been interesting? So I don't have the answer to that question. I would think that it matters. I would think that it matters enormously. But what's been interesting to me, and that I feel like people haven't looked at, is that so each of these histories, I'm looking at like 70-year time periods or 75-year time periods. The institutions are created in one moment, but how they function really changes over time, right? And even the institutional structure changes over time. Like that image of the Columbia I kept showing is actually of an institution that was plonked on top of the BPA in 1980, and now really sort of needs to be understood as kind of a co-governance institution, and that's part of why things in the Columbia work relatively well now. So institutions, even when they're created, I mean, this is part of what's been really so interesting to me, right? Like, we have these visions that we're going to create an institution, and it's going to continue on in whatever vision we embedded in it. But actually, they continue on in a whole bunch of different ways, and they have their own trajectories, and then they're influenced. And so that's really been my question, is like, we embed these ideals and this river basin geography. How does that actually play out through all of that, through the Cold War, through neoliberalism, through, all the things that these institutions have faced? Does it still play a role at all? And what I've been interested to think is that it seems like it actually does still play a role, just not in necessarily the ways we expect.
Can I just follow up on that? So this is a conversation I hope we can continue tomorrow and beyond.
But first of all, because almost to a frightening degree, we do see institutional design features replicated across the world. Right? We are trying to learn from one another and incorporate best practices, but we often run a risk of taking cookie-cutter approaches and putting them on such vastly different situations. So unfortunately, to some level, we actually can do this kind of comparison and have this conversation, but I think with some interesting results, and hopefully also in terms of looking forward. And I keep having this idea, this image that TSU brought in, I think earlier, of kind of keeping water out of certain areas, but then the water comes rushing back in. And so I'm kind of thinking of these institutions as we're kind of putting these structures in place, but then there are certain kinds of currents when we look over time, such as conflict, one that you identified in your talk, that keep kind of rushing back in, and we can see how these design features work over time, or don't.
You know, having written on the Columbia River Basin Authority myself, and you know, I had maybe 13 years of support from NSF to look at river basin compacts and interstate relationships. And one of the things that I began to be pretty concerned about in terms of the literature is that, I mean, I'm looking at your outcomes here. One of the things that we don't do very well, and I think, you know, you may have something to express on this too, is that we don't link procedural outcomes like cooperative outcomes or consensus-based planning or whatever, collaborative decision-making, with ecological indices. And there's a real need to do that from a comparative perspective. So if you think about methodologically, how do you go about thinking about comparative ecosystem-based management frameworks that deal with rivers? I think there's a lot of possibility to link up with those indices projects that are developing globally, and even include ocean indicators within that.
Yeah.
And these institutional challenges, like whether or not there's clear authority or institutional structural issues, really are interesting linkages that need to be made, and they haven't been made in the literature. And I think that's a good sort of framework for future research to think about.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. Well, one last question from Jake, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sorry, I also don't mean to dumb this conversation down, but I do have a more specific question about the Columbia River Basin. I'm from Nevada, so this is why I'm asking the question. But I was just wondering if, I mean, they have two branches of negligible rivers that flow into the Columbia Basin. So I was just, wondering if they see any of the benefits from the power systems and all of that.
Yeah, so this paper is actually a follow-up to a paper that I had published last year in Water Alternatives called Parcelling Out the Watershed, which is the longer case study of the Columbia case. And the basic story is that the three states that have just a small part of the Columbia, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming, with Wyoming having the most water of the three, really haven't wanted to be part of the system that much for a variety of reasons. Often the upriver states were afraid that the regional system would take their water, and I don't know the specifics. But there was one time that they really did come in, and that was in 1964 when the Columbia River Treaty was signed. There were a whole bunch of other agreements that had to go along with it to make it all work. And one of them was, I don't know, some of you have probably seen that National Geographic map of the national electric power grid. The longest high voltage grid in the country, and one of the longest, I think, in the world still, goes from the Columbia River to Los Angeles. That had to get built, and following 1964, because the Columbia River Treaty was going to produce so much extra power, you had to sell it somewhere, and the only market was in Southern California, basically. The problem was that the whole reason for the political support for the BPA and the Columbia River power system was the privileged regional power rates, right? So you enable that power to get delivered to California, and you're going to lose that. So at the same time as the Columbia River Treaty happened between two nations, you had to have a federal law passed that was a regional preference law that said anybody in the region is going to have preference over Columbia River power before anyone out of the region. Well, that was where Nevada came in. All the rural electric cooperatives on the borders of the basin basically said, we need to be into that act. And so the extension of the basin basically extended out to include these rural electric cooperatives on the Montana and Nevada and Utah borders. So it's a wonderful little example as I started thinking about the spaces that interact with a river basin. In the story of the Connecticut and the Columbia, it's not just states. It's local towns, it's counties, it's electric power districts, it's tribal reservations, it's ceded tribal areas where tribes still have hunting, fishing rights. All of these become areas that have various different kinds of political and legal claims that then interact. And I guess I just want to follow up on a point that Colleen made that was just so wonderful about the fact that participation in the Mekong is not always so participatory. If your only spaces that are represented in this negotiation are national spaces, there's a lot that gets missed. So part of why the story of the Connecticut and the Columbia, I think, are as positive as they are is because these other spaces did have various different kinds of representation and legal and political inroads, at least eventually.
Thank you all for coming and for your questions, and thank you, panelists, for your excellent presentations.
This concludes today's sessions, and now we're actually going to go and eat again. And the dinner tonight at 6:30 is in the Brainerd Commons, which is on Blinn Road. Let me give some explanations and let me tell you where it is. Exactly. Well, we'll take you. Don't worry. You don't have to walk. The participants will be delivered. So it is